Welcome, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something fundamental for cybersecurity: public key certificate management and its uses out there in the real world.
Yeah, it's a huge topic. Foundational, really.
Absolutely. We're pulling insights from some great resources, particularly digging deep into computer security and the internet, Tools and Jewels, the second edition, to give you, well, a really solid understanding. This is aimed at experts, professionals in the field.
Right. People who need the nitty-gritty.
Exactly. Our mission today, to unpack the essential knowledge, the tech underneath, different architectures, and, the challenges that keep cropping up with PKI certificates and how they make things like TLS and secure email actually work.
It's a lot to cover, but super important.
It is. And you're listening to InfoSecTube. If you get value from this deep dive, please do hit that like button and definitely subscribe to the @InfoSecTube channel. We've got more deep dives coming.
Great stuff.
Okay, let's jump in. First things first, why is keeping public keys? Well, why is their integrity so absolutely critical?
That's really the starting point, isn't it? If you can't trust that a public key actually belongs to the person or entity you think it does, then public key crypto just falls apart.
How so?
Well, imagine you want to send an encrypted message. You need the recipient's public key. If an attacker swaps in their public key instead, game over. They can read everything.
Right. The whole security promise is broken.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you need a rock-solid way to tie a public key to its owner's identity. That's public key integrity.
And that binding, that's where certificates come in, like digital passports for keys.
That's a great analogy. Yeah. A public key certificate is basically a digitally signed statement. It says, this specific public key belongs to this specific person or entity, the subject.
Signed by whom?
Signed by a trusted third party called a certification authority, or CA. The CA puts its digital signature on the certificate, essentially vouching for that link between the key and the subject.
Okay, so if I'm using a certificate, the relying party, I need to trust the CA that issued it.
Precisely. Your trust in the certificate flows from your trust in the CA. And to check the CA's signature, you need the CA's own public key. That's the core trust relationship.
It's layers of trust, then. Trust the cert because you trust the CA, trust the CA because you have their verified key. What information is actually inside one of these certificates? What fields should we really know?
Okay, so the standard format, XORS 509 version 3, is packed with info, some key ones. Version, obviously. A unique serial number from the CA, vital for revocation.
Right.
The issuer, that's the CA's name. The validity period, the not before and not after dates.
Yeah.
Use it outside that window.
Makes sense.
Then the subject, the owner's name. Public key info, the algorithm like RSA or ECC, and the key value itself. And then critically, the extension fields.
Extensions. They add a lot of nuance, don't they?
Huge amount, like subject alternative name or SN, that's one cert cover, multiple domain names or email addresses. Super common now.
Yeah, you see that everywhere.
Then basic constraints tells you if it's a CA certificate and maybe limits how deep the chain can go. Key usage restricts what the key can do, signing, encrypting, key agreement, etc.
Okay.
CRL distribution points point to where you find revocation info. And finally, the signature algorithm used by the CA and the CA's actual digital signature over the whole thing. Those are the big ones.
You mentioned name for subject and issuer. What's the deal with that structure?
Right. The name type forms what's called a distinguished name, or DN. It's a set of attribute value pairs like country C, organization, O, organizational unit, OU, common name, CN.
Like CUSO example corp CN www.example.com.
Exactly like that. The idea is that combination uniquely identifies the entity. The CN for a website is usually the domain name. Understanding DNs is key to interpreting certificates.
Okay. Given how much relies on CAs, what kind of checks, what due diligence should they be doing before issuing a certificate?
A lot, ideally. Their whole value proposition is trust, right? So reputable CAs need to verify a few things. First, does the requester actually have the corresponding private key? Often done with a challenge response.
Proving possession. Makes sense.
Second, if it's for, say, a domain name or email, they need proof of control, like responding to an email at that domain or changing a DNS record.
That sounds like domain validation, or DV.
Exactly. For higher assurance certs, like OV or EV organization validated or extended validation, they do more. They check the organization's legal existence, maybe verify physical addresses, phone numbers. For EV, the checks are pretty rigorous.
So professionals should look at the CA's practices, their CP and CPS.
Absolutely. The Certificate Policy, CP, and Certification Practice Statement, CPS, lay out exactly what validation steps they take for different certificate types, crucial documents for assessing a CA.
And if I need a certificate, say, for my web server, how do I get one?
Typically, you generate the key, pair the public and private key. That's best practice, keeps the private key under your control.
Right. Never share the private key.
Never. Then you create a certificate signing request, a CSR. It's a standard format, like PKCS tag 10. Contains your DN, your public key, maybe other info. You send that CSR to the CA.
Are there standard ways to send it?
Yeah, protocols like RFC 4210 exist for managing this enrollment. The CA does its validation checks based on the certificate type you requested. If all good, they sign your CSR, creating the X.509 certificate, and send it back to you.
Okay, we've got certificates, CAs. Let's zoom out. What exactly is public key infrastructure, PKI? What's the big picture?
PKI isn't just one thing. It's the whole system. The tech, policies, procedures, people, everything needed to manage public keys, private keys, and certificates through their entire life cycle.
And the goal?
The main goal is enabling trust for secure communications and transactions. It provides the framework to authenticate who you're talking to using their long-term keys, and then maybe set up temporary session keys for encrypting data, ensuring integrity, digital signatures. Those signatures have legal nuances.
Who's the foundation for digital trust?
Pretty much, yeah.
What are the core pieces of a functioning PKI?
You can break it down into roughly 4 parts. 1, the data structures, the certificates themselves, key formats. 2, the crypto toolkits and systems that automate key generation, certificate handling, revocation.
The software side.
Right. 3, the architectural components, CAs are key, but also maybe registration authorities, RAs, directories where you find certificates. 4, the procedures and protocols that define how everything works, from requesting a cert to handling its expiration or revocation. All 4 need to work together.
Compared to older methods like just using shared secrets, what are the main advantages PKI offers us?
Several big ones. Automation is huge. Managing keys and trust at scale is much easier with PKI than trying to distribute shared secrets everywhere. Scalability, too, adding new users or systems is generally less painful.
And security.
From a security perspective, public key crypto itself offers better key management. If one private key is compromised, it doesn't necessarily blow up the whole system like compromising a single shared secret might. And often, convenience things like single sign-on become feasible.
You mentioned managing long-term private keys is tough. Why? And what are these registration authorities, RAs?
Protecting those long-term private keys is paramount. If a CA's private key gets stolen, or even a heavily used server's private key, well, it's bad news. Secure storage, maybe in hardware security modules, HSMs, strict access control, lifecycle management, it's complex.
And RAs?
RAs basically act as helpers for CAs. They often handle the front-end administrative work, like verifying the identity of someone requesting a certificate before passing the validated request to the CA for signing. It splits the workload, lets the CA focus on the core signing function, common in large PKIs.
Okay, let's shift gears. When my browser gets a certificate from a website, how does it decide whether to trust it? Talk us through certificate chain validation.
Right, this is critical. It's rare that the certificate you get, say from a website, is signed directly by a root CA that your browser inherently trusts. Usually it's signed by an intermediate CA.
And that intermediate CA certificate?
That's signed by another CA, maybe another intermediate, or maybe finally by a root CA. It forms a chain, potentially several certificates long, linking the end entity certificate, the websites, back to a trust anchor, a root CA certificate your system already trusts.
So what steps does my browser actually take to validate that chain?
It's a multi-step process. First, check the validity period of every certificate in the chain. None can be expired. Second, check if any certificate in the chain except the root has been revoked. Big topic, we'll get to that.
Okay, validity, revocation.
Third, mathematically verify the digital signature on each certificate using the public key from the signing CA certificate, the next one up the chain. Fourth, ensure the signing CA's public key is itself trusted. Either it's the root anchor or its certificate validates correctly further up the chain.
Makes sense.
What else? Fifth, check the subject or subject alternative name in the ended entity certificate. Does it actually match the website domain you're trying to reach? Critical check?
Prevents impersonation.
Exactly. Sixth, check for any constraints in the certificate extensions. Things like key usage. Is the certificate even allowed to be used for TLS server authentication? or path length constraints from the CAs.
Got it.
And finally, if it wasn't signed directly by a trust anchor, the whole chain, from the root down to the server certificate, must validate successfully through all these steps. Any failure anywhere breaks the chain, and the certificate is untrusted.
You used that passport analogy before for policy constraints. How does that fit in here? Just because the chain validates doesn't mean it's okay for any use.
Right. Think of it like getting a visa. Your passport, the certificate might be perfectly valid, genuine, not expired, issued by a recognized country, a trusted CA chain. But that doesn't automatically mean you get entry, trust for a specific purpose.
Oh, okay.
The certificate might have a policy identifier saying it was issued with low assurance, maybe just DV. Your application, say a high-security banking portal, might have its own policy saying it only accepts OV or EV certificates, even if the DV certificate technically validates. The relying party's policy matters.
So validation confirms authenticity, but policy dictates acceptable use. How do we establish that initial trust in a key outside the chain? Out-of-band channels, fingerprints.
Yeah, this is crucial for bootstrapping trust, especially for things like self-signed certificates or root CA keys themselves. An out-of-band channel is just a separate, trusted way to communicate.
Like a phone call.
You're right.
Or a secure website.
Exactly. You might get a public key file via email, which isn't secure, but then you check its fingerprint, a short hash of the key, like SHA-256, against a value you got over the phone or saw on their official HTTPS site. If the fingerprints match, you're much more confident the key wasn't tampered with.
And self-signed certs rely heavily on this.
Absolutely. With a self-signed cert, there is no CA signature to verify. The only way to trust it is if you obtained it or verified its fingerprint through some trusted out-of-band method. Fine for internal testing, maybe, but not for public sites. Browsers will scream about them.
Right. Which brings us to browsers and their trust anchors. How do they manage this? What happens with untrusted certs?
Browsers come with a preloaded set of root CA certificates, their trust anchors. These are from CAs. The browser vendor, like Mozilla, Google, Apple, Microsoft, has vetted and decided to trust.
So when I visit an HTTPS site,
your browser gets the site certificate and tries to build that chain back to one of its built-in trust anchors. If it finds a valid chain, using all the checks we discussed, it shows the padlock connection secure.
And if it can't, if the chain is broken or it's self-signed or expired,
then you get those big, scary warnings. Your connection is not private. Potential security risk ahead. It flags that the certificate couldn't be validated against its trusted roots. Clicking through those warnings, well, it can be risky.
Definitely. What about 2FU and QFU trust on first use? Check on first use.
2FU is common in things like SSH. The first time you connect, it asks, hey, I don't recognize this server's key, trust it. If you say yes, it remembers it. The danger is an attacker could be intercepting that first connection.
Man in the middle on first contact.
Exactly. COFU, check on first use, is safer. It means on that first connection, you don't blindly trust. You take an extra step to verify the key's fingerprint out of band before accepting it. Much better practice.
And this ties into trust anchor justification, doesn't it? Why is being careful about what we trust so important?
Hugely important. Principle P17 highlights this. When you mark a key or a CA cert as a trust anchor, you're saying, I will implicitly trust anything signed by this key or anything that chains back to it. That's a massive decision.
Especially for non-technical users facing confusing prompts.
Precisely. If you mistakenly trust a malicious CA or just don't understand the implications, you could be exposed. And these trust decisions often stick around for a long time in system settings. Justification is key.
Okay, let's dive deeper into those X.509 v3 extensions. You mentioned SAN and basic constraints. What problems do extensions solve overall?
They had flexibility and control that the basic certificate fields couldn't provide alone. They let CAs and users specify policies, constraints, add more identity types, define how keys should be used. They make certificates much more versatile.
And they can be marked critical.
Yes. If an extension is marked critical, any system trying to validate the certificate must understand and process that extension. If it doesn't recognize a critical extension, it must reject the certificate. That prevents misinterpretation. Non-critical extensions can be safely ignored if not understood.
What are some other really important extensions we see often?
We covered basic constraints, the CA flag, pathline constraint, key usage as vital digital signature, key encipherment, CRL sign, etc. Specifies the allowed cryptographic operations.
Right.
The extended key usage, EKU, gets more specific about application use. Common values are server auth for TLS web servers, client auth for TLS clients, code signing, email protection.
So key usage is broad crypto, EKU is specific purpose.
Kind of, yeah. Subject alternative name, SAN, is ubiquitous now for listing domain names, IPs, emails. If SAN is present and critical, it often overrides the subject field for identity checking.
Good to know.
Name constraints are powerful for CAs. A CA can use this in its own certificate to restrict the kinds of names, like domain suffixes or email realms, that subordinate CAs are allowed to issue certificates for. Helps manage trust in hierarchies.
Controlling the scope of delegated trust.
Exactly. And certificate policies contain OIDs, object identifiers, that point to human-readable documents describing the policies under which the certificate was issued. This lets relying parties judge the level of assurance. EV certificates rely heavily on specific policy OIDs.
What about cross-certificate pairs? How do they link different PKIs?
Cross-certificates are how you build bridges between separate PKI domains or hierarchies. Imagine two organizations, each with their own internal CA. If they want their employees to trust each other's internal certificates, their CAs can issue certificates for each other.
So CAA issues a cert for CAB's public key, and CAB issues one for CAA's public key.
Exactly. That's a cross-certificate pair. It creates a trust path between the two domains. Relying parties in Org A can now potentially validate certificates issued by CAB by following the path through the cross-certificate. Extensions like name constraints are crucial here to limit the scope of the trust being extended.
Okay. Certificates eventually expire, but sometimes they need to be invalidated before their not after date. Let's talk revocation. Why is it needed?
Revocation is absolutely essential. The main reason is private key compromise. If an attacker steals the private key corresponding to a certificate, that certificate can no longer be trusted, even if it hasn't expired.
Makes sense. Any other reasons?
Sure. Maybe the information in the certificate changes, like the person leaves the organization, or the key is being replaced with a stronger one, key supersession, or the certificate just isn't needed anymore. Without revocation, bad certificates could float around, causing problems.
So how do we find out if a certificate has been revoked? What are the main methods?
The classic method is the Certificate Revocation List, or CRL. The CA periodically publishes a signed list of the serial numbers of all the certificates it has revoked that haven't yet expired.
How do I get this list?
Relying parties download the CRL, maybe via HTTP or LDAP, and check if the certificate they're validating is on the list. The downside, CRLs can get huge for busy CAs, making downloads slow and cumbersome.
So scalability issues with big CRLs. Are there ways around that?
Yes. One way is using CRL distribution points, CDPs. The certificate itself contains pointers, URLs, to where smaller, potentially partitioned CRLs can be found. For instance, a CRL might only cover a specific range of serial numbers or revocation reasons.
Okay, smaller chunks.
Another approach is delta CRLs. Instead of downloading the full list every time, you download a base CRL once and then periodically get smaller delta CRLs containing only the changes since the last base or delta CRL. Reduces bandwidth.
Incremental updates. Makes sense. What about checking in real time?
That's where the Online Certificate Status Protocol, OCSP, comes in. Instead of downloading a list, the relying party sends a query directly to an OCSP responder, a server run by or trusted by the CA, asking about the status of one specific certificate.
Like asking, is serial number 123 still good?
Exactly. The responder sends back a signed response, good, revoked, or unknown. It's much more immediate than CRLs.
Any downsides to OCSP?
Well, it puts load on the OCSP responder,
Yeah.
and it reveals to the responder which sites the user is visiting, which has privacy implications.
All right.
To help with that, there's OCSP stapling. The web server itself periodically gets assigned OCSP response for its own certificate and staples it into the TLS handshake. The browser gets the proof of status directly from the server, saving a round trip and improving privacy.
That sounds efficient.
It is, when it's implemented and supported correctly.
Our source material mentioned the timeline of key compromise, highlighting delays. Why is that important here?
It shows the gap, the window of vulnerability. There's lag between when a key is compromised, when it's detected and reported, when the CA revokes it, when that revocation info is published, CRLOCSP update, and when a relying party actually checks and gets the update. During that gap, a compromised cert might still be accepted. OCSP helps shorten that gap compared to less frequent CRL updates.
Are there completely different ways to handle this risk, maybe avoiding revocation altogether?
Couple of ideas. One is short-lived certificates. Issue certs valid for only, say, a day or even hours. If a key gets compromised, the certificate expires quickly anyway, minimizing the need for revocation. But it means constant reissuance, which is overhead.
High churn.
Yeah, an extreme version is on-demand certificates issued just for a single session. Very high overhead. Another idea, more radical, is a trusted key server that only serves currently valid public keys, doing away with certificates and revocation lists. May be feasible in closed systems, but challenging at internet scale.
Can CA certificates themselves be revoked? And what about the root trust anchors?
Yes, intermediate CA certificates can absolutely be revoked if, say, their private key is compromised. There are special certification authority revocation lists, CRLs, for this. When validating a chain, you must check the revocation status of all intermediate CAs in the path.
But not the root itself.
Revoking a root trust anchor is a huge deal. It basically invalidates potentially millions of certificates. It's rare and handled out of band, usually via operating system or browser updates that remove the compromised root from the trusted list.
Lastly, on revocation, what about denial of service risks? If I can't reach the CRL or OCSP server, what happens?
That's a major concern. If an attacker can block access to revocation information, what should a relying party do? The choice is between fail open, assume the cert is okay if you can't check, or fail closed, reject the cert if you can't check.
Fail open sounds dangerous.
It is. It violates the safe defaults principle. P2. It means an attacker could use a revoked certificate just by DOSing the revocation service. Fail closed is generally safer, but it means legitimate connections might fail if the revocation service is temporarily down. It's a tricky trade-off.
Wow, okay. That covers validation and revocation really well. Let's move up a level to the overall structures, PKI architectures, and trust models.
Right, so beyond the individual certificate, how do we organize trust on a larger scale? A certificate trust model is the overall system, the design, the rules, the software that dictates how applications decide which certificates are valid and for what purpose.
And the model itself doesn't guarantee trustworthiness.
No, that's key. The model provides the framework for making trust decisions based on cryptography and pre-agreed anchors. But choosing the right anchors and ensuring CAs follow procedures, that's where actual trustworthiness comes from.
The source says a trust model implements a philosophy or goal. What does that mean practically?
It means the design reflects choices about how trust should work. Who gets to be a CA? How is trust delegated? How strictly are policies enforced? Is it top-down or bottom-up? The model shapes the technology to fit those goals. A government PKI might have a very different philosophy and thus model than a community web of trust.
And the standards like X.509 give us the tools to build these different models.
Exactly. X.509 RFCs. They provide the building blocks. Certificate formats, extensions, protocols. Communities can then use these blocks to construct a PKI and trust model tailored to their specific needs, automotive, banking, web browsing, whatever.
Let's look at some specific models. Model I, single CA domains, and linking them. Sounds simple.
It's the most basic. Everyone in a group trusts one CA. Think of a small company's internal CA. Simple within the group. But if two such groups need to trust each other, you need to link their CAs. Two common ways are a ring mesh, where CAs cross-certify each other in a loop, or using a bridge CA, a central CA that cross-certifies with each of the individual CAs. The bridge model scales better if you have many domains. Managing those cross-certificates is the main challenge.
Model 2, strict hierarchy, top-down trust.
Yep, like a tree. You have one single root CA at the top. It certifies intermediate CAs below it, which might certify other CAs or entities. Everyone trusts the root. To validate any certificate, you build a chain back up to that single trusted root. Very clear lines of trust.
And the variation hierarchy with reverse certificates.
Similar tree structure, but two twists. CAs might issue certs up to their parents, reverse certificates, and often end users trust their local issuing CA as their primary anchor, not necessarily the ultimate root. Trust can then flow up, down, or sideways from that local anchor using the various CA certificates. Gives lower levels more autonomy.
Model 3, ring mesh of tree roots, connecting multiple hierarchies.
Right. You have several independent hierarchies, each with its own root CA. You then create cross-certificates between these root CAs. This links the separate trees into a larger trust fabric. Users in one tree can potentially trust users in another by following the path through the cross-certified roots.
Okay. Then Model 4, forest of hierarchical trees, the browser model. How's that different?
Also involves multiple independent CA trees. But instead of cross-certificates between the roots, the trust comes from the entity, the browser. The browser has a preloaded list of many trusted root CA keys, the trust store. It can trust a certificate from any of these trees as long as it chains back to one of the roots in its list. The roots themselves don't need to trust each other.
Ah, so trust is based on the browser's built-in list, not CA to CA relationships.
Exactly. That's the dominant models for the public web.
Model V, decentralized CA trust, the enterprise model. Sounds more flexible.
Often, yes. In large enterprises, you might have multiple CAs, maybe departmental ones. Trust relationships can be more complex, less strictly hierarchical. Cross-certificates might exist between CAs at different levels, not just roots. End users might trust their local CA. It often grows organically, bottom-up, creating a complex trust graph. Flexible, but potentially harder to manage.
And finally, Model 6, user control, the PGP web of trust. Radically different.
Totally different paradigm. No central CAs at all. Each user is their own authority. You manage your own key pair and decide which other users' keys you trust. Trust is built by users signing each other's keys, ideally after verifying identity in person. You might also trust introducers. It creates a decentralized web of trust based on individual endorsements.
So across all these models, the two defining factors seem to be what trust anchors are configured in the clients and how the CA certificates define the relationships and trust flow.
That sums it up perfectly. Those two things really shape the architecture and how trust propagates.
Okay, let's apply this to the big one. TLS certificates for websites. The CA browser trust model in action.
Right. TLS, the successor to SSL, is what secures HTTPS connections. The original goals were confidentiality, encryption, and server authentication, making sure your browser is talking to the real website and not an imposter. That server authentication relies heavily on certificates issued under this browser trust model.
So from the browser's viewpoint, what makes a TLS certificate trusted?
It means the certificate passes all those validation checks we talked about earlier. Signature verified. Check. Validity period okay. Check. Not revoked. Check. Domain name in the cert matches the site address. Check. And, crucially, does the certificate chain up to one of the root CAs preloaded in the browser's trust store? Check. If all that passes, it's trusted.
We hear about DV, OV, and EV certificates. What's the difference in the real world?
It reflects the level of vetting the CA did before issuing the cert. DV, domain validated, is the baseline. The CA just checks if the applicant controls the domain name, DE, via email or DNS. Quick, cheap, often automated. Doesn't verify the organization behind the site at all.
Okay.
OV, organization validated, requires domain control plus manual checks by the CA to verify the requesting organization's identity, legal name, address, etc. More assurance than BV.
At EV.
EV, extended validation, is the highest standard. Requires extensive manual verification by the CA, legal existence, physical address, operational activity, the requester's authority, exclusive domain control. Follows strict guidelines from the CA browser forum. Browsers used to show the company name prominently for EV certs.
Used to.
Yeah, those visual indicators have become much less obvious in most browsers now, unfortunately.
Which kind of defeats the purpose of making the extra assurance visible to users.
What about fear certificates mentioned in the source? 4. Individual validated isn't really a standard CA-issued grade like DVOVEV. It usually refers to certs, maybe self-signed, that a user has manually decided to trust and added to their local system, bypassing the normal CA trust model. Risky? Generally not recommended unless you really know what you're doing.
What's the role of the CA browser forum?
They're a voluntary group of CAs, browser makers, OS vendors. They set the rules, they maintain the baseline requirements, BRs, the minimum standards all public CAs must follow for DV and OV certs. And they define the stricter extended validation guidelines, EVGs. They aim for consistency and security across the public web PKI.
But communicating the difference between DVOVEV to users remains a challenge.
Big challenge. As mentioned, the browser visual cues are weak or inconsistent. Most average users probably don't know the difference or even notice, so the extra effort and cost of OVEV might not translate into the user trust CAs and site owners hope for.
What about self-signed certs for websites now?
Browsers really hate them for public sites. You'll get loud warnings. They might be okay for internal dev test servers where you can manually install the cert as trusted, but for anything public-facing, they destroy user trust. Stick to CA-issued certs.
The source mentioned a large number of trusted CAs back in 2013. Is that still an issue?
Yes, browsers still trust a large number of root CAs, perhaps over 100 spread across dozens of organizations globally. The problem is, any one of those trusted CAs can technically issue a certificate for any domain name.
So a compromise or mistake at one CA?
Could lead to rogue certificates being issued, say for Google.com or your bank site, that browsers would implicitly trust. It's a significant concentration of risk and a violation of defense in depth.
What are some other major vulnerabilities in this model?
Well, historically, browser support for revocation checking, CRLS OCSP, has been poor or inconsistent, meaning compromised certificates might still be accepted. Trust agility is limited. Users have little practical control over the huge list of built-in trust anchors. Accountability for intermediate CAs can be murky, and TLS stripping attacks, forcing connections down to unencrypted HTTP, are still a threat.
Are things like certificate transparency, CT, and DOIN helping?
They're trying. CT forces CAs to log all issued TLS certs publicly. This allows domain owners and others to monitor for misissued or rogue certificates much more easily. It increases transparency and accountability.
And DANE?
DANE uses DNSE, secure DNS, to let domain owners publish information about their correct TLS certificates directly in their DNS records. Browsers supporting DANE could then check DNS for validation info, reducing reliance on the traditional CA system. It gives domain owners more control. Adoption is still limited, though.
And underlying all this is the security of the crypto libraries themselves? Like OpenSSL?
Absolutely. Vulnerabilities like Heartbleed and OpenSSL showed how a single bug in a critical library could expose private keys and sensitive data across vast swaths of the internet. The security of the foundations is critical.
And things like CDNs and shared hosting add more complexity.
They do. Using a content delivery network or shared hosting often means the website's private TLS key is held by the CDN or hosting provider, not just the site owner. That's another party you need to trust. Plus, practices like issuing massive cruise liner certificates covering thousands of domains add different kinds of risk. And non-browser apps using TLS sometimes get validation wrong, opening doors for attacks.
Okay, let's switch to our final major application. Secure email, end-to-end encryption, key distribution.
Right. End-to-end secure email means the message is encrypted on the sender's machine and only decrypted on the recipient's machine. The mail servers in between just handle opaque blobs.
Sounds ideal for privacy. Why isn't it everywhere?
The two classic barriers: key management, generating, storing, backing up keys is hard for average users, and key distribution. How do I reliably get the correct public key for the person I want to email securely? These hurdles have really hampered widespread adoption, despite decades of effort. Secure email development actually drove a lot of early PKI work.
We'll get into PM, PGP, SEMA soon. But conceptually, how does secure email usually work with PKI?
Okay, standard email goes through your client, MUA, submission servers, MSA, transfer agents, MTA, delivery agents, MDA. Secure email needs to protect the message content end-to-end. It usually does this by adding a security layer or header to the email.
What's in that security header?
Typically, it contains the actual symmetric key used to encrypt the email body, but that symmetric key is encrypted separately using the public key of each recipient, plus identifiers for the algorithms used.
So the message key is encrypted multiple times, once per recipient?
Usually, yes. The header also contains the sender's digital signature over the message content, the signing algorithm ID, and information to help the recipient find and verify the sender's public key. Often the sender's certificate or certificate chain is included right there.
And senders often encrypt the message key to themselves, too.
Common practice, yeah. So they can decrypt their own sent messages later from their sent items folder.
How do people solve that key distribution problem getting the recipient's key?
Two main centralized approaches. One is a public key server. People upload their public key associated with their email address. You query the server to get the key. Trust depends on the server's security.
Like PGP key server.
Exactly. The other approach is a certificate directory. People get X.509 certificates from a CA, and those certs are published in a directory, often using LDAP. You query the directory, get the certificate. Trust now comes from validating the CA's signature on the certificate.
What are the pros and cons of using certificates versus just bare public keys from a server?
Certificates offer auditability via the CA process and aim to solve the identity binding problem through CA validation. But they require revocation mechanisms, CRLS, OCSP, and add validation complexity. A simple key server might be simpler initially, but puts more onus on trusting the server itself and verifying the key owner link somehow.
Interesting that the email headers to, from, subject usually aren't encrypted in these schemes.
Yeah, that's a limitation. Those metadata fields remain visible to mail servers for routing and filtering. Encrypting headers completely breaks standard email transport protocols. It requires a fundamental redesign, which hasn't seen widespread adoption yet.
Why is signing before encrypting the common practice?
Good question. It ensures the signature applies to the original plaintext. The recipient decrypts first, then verifies the signature on the content they just revealed. This protects the signature's integrity even if the encryption is somehow weak or broken later.
And we need to be clear, this is different from just using webmail over TLS, right?
Absolutely critical distinction. Using Gmail or Outlook.com over HTTPS means the connection to the server is encrypted via TLS. but the email on their server is usually plain text. The provider can read it. True end-to-end encryption protects the content from the provider as well.
What about complications like mailing lists or forwarding?
They mess things up for simple end-to-end models. How does the sender encrypt for every unknown member of a mailing list? If someone forwards an encrypted email, is the new recipient able to decrypt it? These require more complex solutions.
And the big conflict, end-to-end encryption versus server-side scanning for spam and malware.
Yeah, the fundamental tension. If the provider can't read the email, they can't easily scan it for threats. Solutions like key escrow, where the provider holds a copy of your key, are sometimes proposed, but they destroy the end-to-end privacy guarantee and introduce huge risks. It's a major sticking point.
Okay, let's finally look at the specific technologies. UIO, PE, PE, PGP. Start with SMI.
SEMAS-MIO, Secure Multipurpose Internet Mail Extensions, is built on X.509 certificates and a traditional CA-based PKI. It relies on trusted CAs and often certificate directories, LDAP, for key discovery. It supports signing and encryption.
Where has it seen success?
Mostly in enterprise environments and government, where organizations can manage the PKI, issue certificates to employees, and configure mail clients easily. It integrates reasonably well with Outlook and other corporate mail systems. Less successful for general public email due to the certificate hurdles for individuals.
What about PM, the early pioneer?
PM, Privacy Enhanced Mail, was the first big effort in the early 90s. Also used X.509 certificates, but envisioned a strict global hierarchy under a single root, IPRA. It defined policy CAs. Clients would fetch certs, verify chains, check CRLs distributed via email.
Why didn't it take off?
It was probably too complex and ambitious for its time.
Yeah.
Getting the little PKI deployed was a huge challenge. Vendor support was lacking. SEMIA came along as a more pragmatic, flexible alternative and gained more traction.
And PGP, the decentralized approach.
PGP, pretty good privacy. Famously released by Phil Zimmerman in '91, took a totally different path. Focused on individual empowerment, privacy. No CAs, no X.509. Uses its own key format and the web of trust model.
Where users sign each other's keys.
Exactly. Trust is built bottom-up through personal vouching and transitive trust. I trust Bob, Bob trusts Alice, so I have some trust in Alice. Keys are often shared via PGP key servers.
Why hasn't PGP become mainstream then?
Usability, mostly. Managing your keys, understanding the web of trust, verifying keys securely, it requires significant technical understanding. Integration into popular email clients was often clunky. Revocation in the web of trust is also a notoriously difficult problem. It found a strong niche among technical users, but struggled to break out.
So despite decades of work, truly widespread, easy-to-use end-to-end secure email remains elusive. Competing tech, usability, stakeholder conflicts.
That seems to be the story. CVME works well in controlled environments. PGP has its dedicated users, but bridging the gap to make it seamless for everyone on the public internet. That puzzle hasn't been fully solved yet.
This has been incredibly thorough. We've covered public key integrity, certificates, CAs, validation, revocation, PKI architectures, trust models, the whole browser TLS ecosystem, and the long journey of secure email.
Yeah, it really highlights the complexity involved, from the low-level crypto details to the high-level trust architectures and the very human usability challenges. There are always trade-offs between security, convenience, and privacy.
Absolutely. Which brings us to our final thought for you to ponder. Given this ongoing evolution, the persistent usability hurdles, the debates around trust models, what future innovations or maybe fundamental shifts in how we users behave or think about security might finally lead to really widespread, almost invisible adoption of end-to-end secure communication? What needs to change?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is something to think about. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. If you found this useful, please do hit like and subscribe to the InfoSecTube channel for more deep dives into cybersecurity. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone.